Thank you, everyone, for coming together, and welcome to this event jointly sponsored by the Eisenhower Institute and the Office of the President. The conversation we're going to have tonight speaks to the very heart of our democracy and is as timely as it is important. Let me frame our conversation tonight by reaching very far back in time to an 1886 decision by the United States Supreme Court. Now, in fairness, I should be clear, this decision has absolutely nothing to do with voting rights, but rather it related to the consistent action by the city of San Francisco not to give necessary permits to Chinese Americans who were seeking to operate laundry businesses. In the course of evaluating a challenge brought against the city's action, the Supreme Court said this, and here I quote, "The right to vote is a fundamental political right because it is preservative of all rights." It's that last point about voting being preservative of all right that frames, I think, our conversation tonight. The right to vote is at the heart of our democratic system. Laws typically seek to resolve competing interests and claims. What actions do we criminalize? What rights do we protect? Or in the case of 1886, who gets the right to run a laundry business? Government needs to make choices. And in making those choices, it is almost always giving privilege over one set of interests against another set of interests, or in some contexts, deciding whether groups have any rights whatsoever. So when the Supreme Court talked about the right of voting to be preservative of all rights, I imagined it had the essence of democracy in mind. Voting gives voice, voice gives a constituency greater likelihood that its interests will be protected. Of course, the opposite is also true. Interference with the right to vote necessarily places the affected individuals and groups at the margins of society. Their voices carry less weight. Their interest risks being systematically undervalued or ignored. In the aftermath of the most recent presidential election, we have seen a dramatic increase in the efforts at state levels to create new regulations on the ability to exercise the franchise. Opponents argue that these measures are necessary to preserve the election integrity. Others see them as a systematic and deliberate act of disenfranchisement. Tonight's conversation will explore what's happening and the potential implications to our citizens and to our democracy. It's no accident that we are hosting this program during Black History Month. There is a long history of African American access to the franchise being compromised by actions both legal and extra-legal. It is important, indeed essential, that we acknowledge this history and evaluate the current actions with a critical eye about their purposes, as well as their impact on historically underrepresented groups' influence in the political process. These are the questions I suspect we will explore tonight. With that, let me introduce our wonderful executive director of the Eisenhower Institute, Tracie Potts. Tracy joined the college after a long and distinguished career at NBC News, where she covered, among other things, the Supreme Court and other breaking legal developments. Tracy will moderate tonight's conversation and introduce our panelists. But again, thank you for joining us tonight in this very important conversation.
Thank you, Bob, and thank all of you for joining us tonight, both in the room and online. We are glad to have you here as part of this conversation. Our intent tonight at the Eisenhower Institute is to provide an historical perspective and a current perspective around the issue of voting rights and the larger context of what this means for our democracy. Our goal tonight is to pique your interest in ideas and thoughts and perspectives that perhaps you have not considered before. The Eisenhower Institute is nonpartisan. We are not here to make up your minds. We are here to provide information, conversation, and perspective to help you get a better understanding and develop your thoughts and opinions about this issue. We want to expose you to a variety of different perspectives and ideas, and we hope that 90 minutes from now, when you walk out of these doors or when you leave us on Zoom, you leave here well-informed, armed with new information that you did not have when you joined tonight, and hopefully that you are inspired by tonight's conversation. So let's get started. And I'd like to begin with a bit of a personal and historical perspective. Last weekend was my birthday, and I spent part of my birthday in South Carolina with a woman and her husband who run a small bed and breakfast in the small town of Chester, South Carolina. My intent was to go and enjoy some time with them. I ended up getting a bit of a lesson as well as she talked a little bit about her own history. And you're going to hear tonight from Dr. Elizabeth Claytor. She was a political science student at Grambling College back in the late 60s. And she became involved in a demonstration sponsored by what many people commonly call SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, that was involved in not only voting rights, but a number of different issues during that time. Elizabeth was not a demonstrator. She was not someone who typically got involved in civic engagement type activities. But an incident happened at a nearby college. A Black student integrated that college and was later jailed and beaten. And students, including Elizabeth, were very upset about this. And so she decided to step outside of her normal comfort zone and join what she had been assured would be a peaceful, nonviolent demonstration at the county courthouse. So along with her sister and her colleague, she boarded a bus and ended up at the courthouse. And I will let her take over the story from there. What is interesting about this is that what happened at this demonstration shaped her thoughts and her civic engagement on voting rights for 50 years to come. So here's more from Elizabeth.
The courthouse was surrounded by, I know, every policeman, state trooper, guard in the whole region. It appeared to me. It was surrounded by police. They had guns, and they were in a formation that meant that they were ready to do battle. But while we were there on our knees praying, we sort of looked out the corner of our eyes, and they were going through the crowd, picking out every white person that was in our group. And this included, and he wasn't in our group, he was a Life magazine photographer. He was on his own with his cameras, really looked formal and official. And we were sort of happy that it would be broadcast somewhere. And when we knew it, they had pulled him down to the ground, beating him, stumping the camera. That was crazy. That was just, fear, still fear. Then, as if that wasn't enough, they came to get the white student who had integrated Grambling. They pulled him out of the crowd and beat him. Blood was everywhere, and they pulled him over into the jail or the courthouse. We had to leave, and when we got to the bus, we just screamed with delight that we were still alive. We could hardly believe it. It was truly a life traumatic situation for us, a life-threatening situation for us. I'd never done that before in my life. We did it because we wanted the future to be better. And right now, everything is uncertain, and we're not sure about any of it right at this moment. I think the right to vote is one of the most important rights that you can exercise. And I didn't realize at the time that we were demonstrating that really if you did not exercise the right to vote, you were really turning against everything that happened way back then. Because the right to vote then gives you a voice. So my mother had to struggle for the right to vote. And when she did, we celebrated that they didn't have any hard questions for her, because she had to answer questions and answer them truthfully. And she was I remember back, she was so afraid she would not get it right. And we went over things with her. And when she came home and she said that she had passed, we were so delighted. So what went on in the past, just to have the right to vote, should never ever happen again to anybody. And these laws that they're putting in places in the different states, different counties and parishes, they are restricting that right that my mom worked so hard to get to be able to do. When we moved here to Chester, Dave and I went out and registered the whole town to vote, and was and at that time Barack Obama was running for president of the United States. And at that time people were not sure they really had that right to vote. There were a lot of people in the community that had not registered and wasn't sure.
In 2008?
And in 2008, they weren't sure whether they could vote. So we really worked hard to convince them that it was going to be all right, they could vote. And still I vote. And that's what we ought to say. And still I can vote, because then I know I can, I'm participating. I have something to say. People listen to a vote.
So Elizabeth's experience as a college student shaped her civic engagement in the small town where she now lives 50 years later. And we are hopeful that the experiences that our students have here at Gettysburg College, working with the Eisenhower Institute in courses like Dr. Lucy Britt, and you will meet her later, shape their experience and their activism and their advocacy for years to come as well. And you are going to hear from some of those students tonight, because there are many different perspectives, as Bob mentioned, on what's happening today. And so I am proud to introduce two of our students who will be sharing some of those perspectives with us tonight. First, Owen Labruna. Owen is a political science and economics major here at Gettysburg, has also been involved in campaigns, and recently wrote an article on our Ike's Anvil blog entitled "Freedom to Vote Act Saving Our Democracy." We will also hear from Miranda Zamora, who's a junior, also a political science major, minoring in Spanish. She's been active and involved with the Eisenhower Institute, and you will hear a very different perspective from her as well. So welcome, Owen, and welcome, Miranda.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Owen Labruna, and I am a sophomore in political science and economics major here at Gettysburg College. Last semester, I had the opportunity to participate in the Eisenhower Institute's Washington Connections program. As part of this program, we were given the chance to write an op-ed on the policy subject of our choice. After the January 6th insurrection, I began to closely follow the battles over voting rights at both the state and federal level. So I knew early on that I was going to write my op-ed on the Freedom to Vote Act. So the task was ahead of me, to argue in favor of the biggest voting rights act since 1965, a bill almost 600 pages long in 800 words. Sounds easy, right? Obviously, I cannot begin to cover the 600 pages in detail, but I can give a brief introduction to the three components of the Freedom to Vote Act that are of particular importance following the 2020 election. The first is the expansion of early voting. The bill guarantees 2 weeks of early voting, including weekend days, and ensures that polling places will always be in convenient places, such as a college campus, and establishes Election Day as a federal holiday. Second is the expansion of mail-in voting. Passage of the Freedom to Vote Act will result in the ability to request an absentee ballot for any reason, no excuse or explanation necessary. Security measures around mail-in ballots would also be brought into line with that of in-person ballots. This would prevent scenarios like in Texas, where last week it was reported that 34% of Harris County's 13,325 mail-in ballots were flagged for rejection, much higher than the rate previously. Finally, the bill will restore voting rights to thousands of citizens who have been disenfranchised due to being convicted of a felony, ending long-standing Jim Crow era laws meant to disenfranchise voters of color. The Freedom to Vote Act sets the guidelines that will allow our elections to function more effectively while upholding the promise of free and fair elections to all citizens. Expanding early and mail-in voting provides a clear path to increase voter participation, reducing long voting lines, which have been a deterrent to people who may not have had the time to wait in such lines. At times, cities, including larger ones such as Louisville, only had one polling place in the entire city, inevitably leading to excessively long lines on election day. Setting a baseline of 2 weeks of early voting will allow for citizens to vote on a day that does not interfere with work, which is critical to voters who work paycheck to paycheck or are not eligible for paid time off. Likewise, expanding mail-in voting would also reduce lines at polling places and increase the percentage of the population who can cast ballots. Although not widely talked about, statewide vote by mail has already been implemented in states such as Oregon and Utah, and has been proven to be extremely secure and effective. In fact, the fraud rate in Oregon in the year 2018 was only 0.0004% of the 1.9 million votes cast. Additionally, designating election day as a federal holiday will allow many people to vote without taking off work or fear of losing pay for exercising their basic rights. The restoration of voting rights to those with prior felony convictions is another provision that is important to enact. You might be thinking to yourself, why would I want to care about felons? Previously, the state in which a person lived determined if they would receive all of their rights back after serving their sentence. Throughout history, segregationists used this lack of a federal voting rights restoration law to disenfranchise Black Americans, locking them up for trivial or arbitrary reasons and permanently revoking their right to vote. Formerly incarcerated citizens are expected to reintegrate into society, which includes paying taxes. Therefore, they should have the right to vote as they've repaid their debt to society. The main criticisms leveled at the Freedom to Vote Act is that the bill is a federal takeover of elections meant to favor the Democratic Party. However, increasing voter turnout has not usually favored one party over another. Vote by mail in particular has shown not to provide a partisan advantage to Democrats. In addition, this bill keeps the administration of elections at the county level, which is a vital measure to ensure an election security is a decentralized process and ensures bad actors at the national level cannot swing the election just because of them. When it comes to elections, larger turnout means our government has to be accountable to all of us rather than just a select few. The bedrock of our democracy is the right to vote, and as such, we must not only fight against laws chipping away at that bedrock, but also promote laws that expand voting rights and consequently strengthen our democracy. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you again for coming out tonight. As Tracy said, my name is Miranda Zamora. I'm a junior political science major and Spanish minor here at Gettysburg College, and I work as an assistant to the Fielding Center of the Eisenhower Institute. I've also participated in several EI debates and programs and events, and I'm super excited to be speaking to you tonight. Tonight, I'm here to address some of the counterpoints against the recently proposed voting bill. There are some aspects of this legislation that I feel both sides of the political spectrum can agree upon. However, there are some provisions of the legislation that I feel could cause potential harm than more good. And the two that I'm going to talk about tonight are the wider allowances for mail-in voting and the lighter restrictions on ID requirements. The legislation proposed puts a great deal on creating more allowances for mail-in voting. One way in which it does this is by requiring that all states allow anyone who wishes to vote by mail to have the ability to do so. However, we have seen many problems with mail-in voting, especially during the 2020 primaries, which wasn't too long ago. During this time, more than 550,000 mail-in ballots and absentee ballots were disqualified. New York City alone threw out more than 84,000 ballots in their primaries. Studies also show from the 2018 midterm elections in Florida and Georgia that mail-in ballots from younger, minority, and first-time voters are more likely to be thrown out. And here's why. Many new and first-time voters are unfamiliar with the voting process, much less the process of doing so by mail. This leads to mistakes and ballot rejections that could have easily been avoided with the assistance of a poll worker. As for the rejection rate of minority mail-in ballots, researchers couldn't come to a solid conclusion as to why this was, but they did note that areas populated by minority ethnic groups tended to have a lack of voter education programming. Altogether, this research shows that a larger scale of mail-in voting has the potential to disenfranchise a larger group of voters, these being our younger and our minority voters. Now, another issue that I take with this legislation is the fact that it negates the requirement for an individual to show an ID when voting or it at least lightens the requirements of what ID you are allowed to use. I find this provision to be a little bit hypocritical, especially with recent mandates from some cities requiring vaccine cards paired with photo IDs in order to enter certain venues. For example, Muriel Bowser, the mayor of Washington, D.C., mandated as of January 15th that vaccine cards and photo IDs paired together were required of patrons of businesses such as gyms, restaurants, bars, theaters, and other public places where people spend long periods of time. If an argument for a change in the ID requirement at the polls is that such provisions disadvantage minority groups, then the mandate of requiring an ID for entrance to businesses must also at least be taken into reconsideration. Now, many people in our society today question whether or not it even matters if they go out and vote. If you ever had a class here with Professor Scott Bottery, you have definitely heard this question. Trust me, I've had 4 courses with this man so far, and whatever the topic is, he somehow manages to bring it up. And I've always told him the same thing. That being that I am a firm believer of the idea that it is a person's civic duty to cast their vote, and that every person should have the opportunity to get to the polls in order to do so. One provision of the proposed legislation that satisfies this belief is the idea that Election Day should be a national holiday. And this is an idea that I even agree with, as it's a shame that for many people, their commitments to work and to school and to providing for their families end up being the reason that they could not make it to the polls in time. And this could be beneficial to voters. Yet I feel that changes such as widening the availability of mail-in voting and negating the need for an ID when voting can cause more problems, despite the good intentions behind these proposals. Rather, I feel that our focus as a society should be to improve the educational opportunities revolving around our election processes. It would be fairly easy to incorporate lessons about election procedure into a high school or college level government class. And poll workers and election boards could also work to develop local and even online programs to educate the community in issues such as how to fill out a ballot, where to get your ID, and then answer any other common questions about the election process. There are aspects of this legislation that I do agree with, but these are the few of the counterpoints that I have found while doing research on this legislation. And I think that is everything from me, so I will turn it back to Tracy. Thank you all.
At this time, I'm going to invite Dr. Lucy Britt to come join me for a conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for being here. Let's talk about legislation, and let's talk about some of the laws, not only at the federal level that are being proposed, but also some of the state laws that, again, some have described as restrictive of voting, and others have described as restrictive of states' rights. This is, by the way, part of what you talk about. You teach a course here on race and voting, and talk to me a little bit about how you present these differences to students.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's really important to start with a bit of a broader historical time frame. So in my class, we talk about from the beginning, within a long history of U.S. federalism, right? There's been this tension between states' rights and the federal government, right? The Constitution gives it to the states the job to administer elections, and then we had basically a long history of not enfranchising most of the country. With the 15th Amendment, we had a guarantee of voting rights to all citizens, but of course, the 15th Amendment wasn't followed by southern states immediately after the end of Reconstruction, right? What followed was Jim Crow and all of the both legal and informal means of restricting Black and Latinx and some other groups from voting through both laws, more formal means, norms, and of course, the violence of racial terror. In the 20th century, we then had the big breakthrough of the Civil Rights Movement, Voting Rights Act, right? The Civil Rights Act was big for voting rights too, but the Voting Rights Act was especially powerful because it preempted states from violating the constitutional right to vote. So I'm sure you had a plan to talk a little bit about Shelby County versus Boulder, and Mr. Gordon does too, but the real power of the Voting Rights Act, which was struck down by Shelby County versus Boulder in 2013, was the ability of the Voting Rights Act, Section 4B, to stop states that had a history of disenfranchising people.
So it was Section 4B and Section 5, right, of the Voting Rights Act. At that point, that the court stepped in and said, wait, we think that the federal government needs to have a role here in determining whether or not local, state governments are doing their job or whether they are disenfranchising voters. And this was a real turning point.
Yeah, I mean, I think of the pre-clearance formula, which is what this part of the Voting Rights Act is called, as an analogy I think of is it's kind of like the difference between a kindergarten teacher waiting for one kindergartner to report to the teacher that someone else is bullying. The difference between that and watching all the kindergartners and making sure they're not bullying and stepping in before it happens. Right, so that was the power of pre-clearance that was kind of gutted by Shelby County versus Boulder. And so, as you're all probably familiar with, there was this flood of new restrictive voting measures and laws that states and jurisdictions passed right after Shelby County versus Boulder. So if we're looking for evidence that the Voting Rights Act was protecting the right to vote, we can look at the moment the floodgates were opened by Shelby as evidence that, well, the Voting Rights Act was probably doing something if right after it was gutted, these laws increased in number.
And so how does that begin to connect to what we're seeing today in terms of a new flood of laws and different types of laws? And we heard both Miranda and Owen talking about that to some degree on the state level.
Yeah, so there was this flood of laws after Shelby. By 2018, 23 states had passed newly restrictive statewide voter laws, but you're right, absolutely. This new moment that we're in, specifically the post-2020 election restrictions, is kind of an astounding moment for this number increasing. So in 2021, the Brennan Center reported that between January 1st and December 7th, 2021, at least 19 states passed 34 laws restricting access to voting. And this is a pretty extraordinary shift. It means that state legislatures, state governments enacted far more restrictive voting laws in 2021 than in any year since the Brennan Center started counting in 2011. So I think we're really seeing a response to the results of and the debates around the 2020 election in the form of this new flood.
Miranda talked about that, Dr. Scott Bottery, and if he were here, I would ask him this question because I know he has much great interest in the U.S. Supreme Court. And so feel free to punt a bit. If
I'm not a legal scholar.
I know. But are we headed back now to a place where the federal government will be pushed to get more involved because we're seeing differences, right? Because depending on which state you live in, your ability to vote, your access to vote could be different just based on what your zip code is in the United States. And this often is the essence of why the courts get involved.
Absolutely, and I realized I forgot to take off my mask. I mean, from an American politics, political science standpoint, all I can say is that our ability to predict what the federal government will do next can lean pretty heavily on both the ideological balance of the Supreme Court, which we know right now is pretty conservative, and the partisan dynamics in the Senate. And we're seeing that the Senate is failing repeatedly to pass these federal legislation.
So let's talk about ideologies a bit, and let's talk about democracy and sort of the broader picture of what all of this means when we consider what is democracy. And how does this argument about voting rights fit into what we have traditionally defined as democracy and where we may be headed?
Yeah, absolutely. So we can think of several different definitions of democracy, right? When you think of what does democracy mean, we might have 17 different answers to that question in this room. One group that measures democracy around the world gave 7 criteria: free and fair elections, rule of law, equal representation, respect for civil and minority rights, polycentrism, and that's just having multiple centers of power within government, pluralism, which is having multiple groups able to have differences of opinions in civil society, and turnover of power, right? Peaceful transfer of power. You could pick other metrics. These are the metrics we can talk about just really briefly. So on those metrics, how is the US faring? So first, free and fair elections. One question is, compared to other liberal democracies around the world, How do they get people to vote? Well, many other liberal democracies don't require voting registration at all. So one thing we could think about is, whether it makes sense to even require people to register to vote, right? The question we could raise is, ought it to be the job of the government to get people ready to vote instead of putting the onus on the individual? Rule of law. Owen talked a little bit about the use of the criminal justice system to disproportionately impact Black citizens and other citizens of color. Michelle Alexander has called this the new Jim Crow. If we are disproportionately incarcerating Black people and other people of color, and then we're also saying if you have a criminal record, depending on the state, you have to serve the entirety of your sentence, sometimes even pay what amounts to a poll tax in Florida, right, to pay off your legal fees before you can even vote. If we're doing these two things together, you can see how this can result in disproportionate disenfranchisement. Equal representation. We don't have proportional representation, right? We have this idea of one person, one vote, but representation that's proportional by party or race, we're not seeing due to these restrictive voting measures, due to gerrymandering, and a few other factors.
And let me just stop you right there. I do want you to finish that, but that's a key point when we talk about the big picture of democracy, because that's a bedrock principle of democracy is representation.
Absolutely. And when we're looking at the results of the House races by states and some of the Republican controlled states in particular, we're seeing pretty disparate outcomes, right? If you believe that there should be somewhat proportional representation in this country, and you're seeing a state that has, 55% of its citizens tend to vote Democratic or registered as Democrats, but Democrats are only winning 40% of the seats in that state, that's what political scientists would call disproportionate. We don't have a right to proportional representation in this country.
And I think this is a question that we often deal with, and I'm not sure that if we could resolve it here in 90 minutes, we would probably, a lot of people would applaud us, but we won't be able to. But I think it's important that people understand in building and running a successful democracy is the goal to have a system that is built from the beginning to be fair, or do we weigh a disproportionate outcome? And how important is it in weighing those two things? And it seems that is a question we have been unable to resolve.
Yeah, I mean, the thing about social science is we can look at whether these restrictive voting laws and measures have disproportionate outcomes. There are different types of measures, right? You can study the results of vote by mail, of voter ID measures, of the felon disenfranchisement. Some of these actually have mixed effects or results in the research that's trying to figure out what the results of these are. So we can't always figure out what the results are, right? Whether they're making it harder to vote, whether they're disproportionately making it harder for Black people or other citizens of color to vote. But what we can look at is some of the motivations to pass these laws, right? We can look at what correlates with support for voting laws or for passing restrictive voting measures. So in one experiment, the people in a survey who were exposed experimentally to a picture of a Black voter and then asked whether you would favor your state implementing voter ID laws, those respondents were more likely to say that we should pass a voter ID law than the respondents who saw a picture of a white voter. So there does seem to be some connection between racial stereotypes, racial stimuli, and getting people to say, yes, we should make voting harder.
Interesting. Let me put a pin in that for just a moment, because I want to make sure that everyone can be involved in this conversation. If you are in the room, we do have microphones where if you have a question for Dr. Britt, and then later, if you have a question for Bruce Gordon, we'll bring him into the conversation in a moment. We would love for you to be able to be a part of this conversation and share your questions or your thoughts. If you're joining us online, please use the Q&A feature, not the chat feature. You won't be able to access that tonight, but please use the Q&A feature, and those questions will be shared with me, and I'll be glad to share them with you. So is there anyone in the room right now who'd like to share a question that Lucy or I can address?
So you started talking a little bit about gerrymandering. I'm curious what your, I guess, assessment is of the new set of maps that are coming out after this last census, where I guess it's kind of evened out a little bit more unexpectedly.
Interestingly, that seems not to be the result of everyone in the state legislatures deciding we should stop gerrymandering, but rather Democrats deciding that it doesn't make sense to hold back from gerrymandering. So a lot of that evening out seems to be a result of Democratic-led state legislatures saying, well, we might as well play dirty too.
Any other thoughts? It's a bit of a quiet room. However, I can see your wheels turning. So this will not be your last opportunity. And I'm also going to check and see if we have anyone online that has thoughts. But please go ahead, because there were some other points that you wanted to make.
About, I could talk about different groups that are disenfranchised, or.
Right, because we talked earlier about the fact that oftentimes when we have conversations about voting rights, we talk about African Americans, right? There are a number of other groups. You talked about some of them. Owen talked about some of them as well, whose vote, first of all, whose vote, when you look at a vote in terms of a block, is significant, but also who feel that they have been disenfranchised. One of the things I know you talk with your students about is the Latinx vote.
Absolutely. I mean, there's a few different categories, both racial and ethnic and other, that are significantly disenfranchised as groups in significant ways. We talk about people with disabilities, many of whom, or for many, of whom the barriers to voting they were already facing have been just exacerbated by COVID, right? We can think about wheelchair ramp access at voting sites. I've done a lot of poll observing and volunteering at polling sites on election days, and I've observed the buttons that you press to get access to parking lot voting not always working, COVID issues, the insufficient application of technology in polling booths for those who need visual and other technology aids. Often poll workers are not sufficiently trained to help those with disabilities vote and to use the equipment. Owen already talked a bit about the incarcerated and the formerly incarcerated. As of 2020, 5.2 million Americans were prohibited from voting due to laws regarding felony and other criminal justice issues. 5.2 million is a lot of people, but I think that is a group in and of itself. In Florida specifically, we have a modern day poll tax, essentially. There was a recent reversal of a direct democracy measure that Florida voters tried to pass, where the state legislature overrode that measure. And the state legislature decided that Floridian formerly incarcerated folks would have to actually pay off their court fees, which amounts to what some voting rights advocates have called a poll tax, right? If you have to pay money to regain your right to vote, that's pretty striking. Then we've got people for whom English is not their first language, with which there's a lot of overlap with Latinx voters. So the VRA says after a certain threshold of people who have limited English proficiency, you have to provide voting materials at the polling booth in the language of the language minority in your county. But what about the people who live in counties that fall just below this threshold, right? People who live in an area where there's only thousands of people with limited English proficiency in the county and not 10,000, right? Then we've got Native Americans. Those who live on reservations often face really serious access to broadband issues around mail and the Postal Service, often don't have permanent addresses that are recognized by the US Postal Service, and may face barriers to voter ID. In some states, tribal IDs are not always recognized, and you have to get a voter ID, which involves going a really far distance to a DMV, sometimes which is only open on Wednesday afternoons once a month.
So let me ask you a question about that, because Miranda brought up a really interesting argument about voter ID. And until recently, I could not get into a restaurant in DC without ID, along with my card showing that I had been vaccinated, my vaccination card. And the argument from people who think that, you know, we should be pushing voter ID laws is, if I can't get into a restaurant, how do you get a ballot?
Yeah, I mean, I think President Juliana, kind of hit the nail on the head, right? When he emphasized this idea that the right to vote is preservative of other rights. We tend to think of the right to vote as a sacred right in this country, at least in kind of popular political discourse. But I think what we're really noticing now is a divergence in which the left seems to be framing voting rights as more of a right, a sacred right that ought to be preserved because it can preserve other rights, other civic engagement. Whereas the right end of the political spectrum is tending to frame voting rights as more of a privilege. So I think a lot of this, question about whether we need to make it harder to vote, easier to vote, how sacred is this right, really comes down to a difference of opinion about this question. Is our voting rights really a right? If you think that they are this sacred right, it's preservative of other rights, I would tend to think that it's more important that we make it easy to access the right to vote than it is to make it easy to access the right to go to a restaurant or a bar.
So wearing your hat as a political scientist, we have a couple of questions from online. Given that election procedures have traditionally been a local prerogative, how far would you go in federalizing election procedures? All states, all procedures, should federal government be contributing for any of the costs of federalization? So this is something, after spending many years in Washington, we hear all the time. You send us a bunch of rules, you don't help us pay for them.
I mean, the federal government, I tend to think that the federal government should take over some of the responsibilities for pre-clearance and monitoring states and local jurisdictions. But that's just my personal opinion. We've had a few attempts by Congress to fill in this gap of what should the pre-clearance formula be now that Shelby County versus Holder rejected the previous pre-clearance formula from the Voting Rights Act. There have been a few different debates about what that pre-clearance formula should be. I tend to think we ought to reinstate pre-clearance by some formula or another.
So here's a question about that. Do you believe that, promoting this program, one of the things that we said is that literacy tests and poll taxes have evolved into laws that require ID. We do now have a debate about that. Do you believe that's a fair history of voter ID laws? Do you think that voter ID laws are inherently unfair? I think this gets to your question about whether or not it is a basic right that is a foundational right for others.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like there's a few ways to answer that question. One is the direct answer, is it unfair? The answer to that depends on how hard or easy it is to get a voter ID. And we know that different groups in this country face more barriers to getting a voter ID. It costs money, even in states where it's free. It costs resources, sometimes money to get to a DMV. Sometimes you might have to sacrifice sacred paid time off or lose wages. Wage workers are, of course, more severely impacted by the time off work you have to take than salaried workers. So there's socioeconomic components to how hard it is to get an ID. And then because in this country, racial inequities overlap often with socioeconomic equities, there are racial implications for those socioeconomic inequities. to me, it really comes down to the question, do the benefits outweigh the costs, right? One thing I probably should have said at the beginning, and that I always say at the beginning of my class to kind of clear the air, is that there is no good evidence that there has been widespread voter fraud in the United States in modern political American history. By voter fraud, I mean impersonating someone else, voting for your dead spouse, voting twice. There's no evidence that this is a widespread phenomenon. If that's the case, ought we to make it easier for everyone to vote, or ought we to make it harder for everyone to vote to ward off that potential voter fraud that we haven't seen evidence is actually occurring?
What about this interesting argument that Miranda brought up about mail ballots and whether they are actually disenfranchising, because people, they're complicated, right? And people, you forget one X and people fill them out incorrectly, and then those ballots are thrown out. And evidence that that is happening disproportionately among younger voters in areas with a larger proportion of minority voters. Her argument was because of possibly lack of voter education. Whatever the reason, the outcome, as we talked about outcomes, could be disenfranchising to some of the very groups for which those laws were put in place to help.
Yeah, and like Miranda noted, I think the research there is still very preliminary because this was so recent. The question for me would be, is the number of people whose ballots were rejected higher than the number of people who would not have been able to vote in person if they had not had the option to vote by mail, right? It seems to me a problem if that answer is yes, and especially a problem if the disproportionality is higher for vote by mail than it would have been if there had been no vote by mail option and the votes had been cast in person. But we do know that a lot of the measures that make it harder to vote in general disproportionately impact voters of color. So we have to consider historical kind of counterfactuals, which is always tricky.
That's why they call it political science.
Yeah.
Right? more research needed. Any other questions from the room? We do have another, and then we do also have another question online.
Hello, I'm sorry, you're gonna hear my ramble / question at the end, but I'm just thinking through all of this. I'm Akila, everybody. Sorry, I'm just thinking through all this because my second capstone in philosophy is on critical race theory, and I'm trying to work through whether or not the question is whether voting right is a civic responsibility or whether it's a duty. And in my personal opinion, I feel like it's a civic responsibility, which therefore the government should dutifully supply the resources to make sure that everyone can equitably go out and vote, find a registered place, have a voting education, but that just isn't the reality. Is there some way that we as individuals can kind of act on the, being in our political science course, being in our public policy course, to kind of help where law has a gap between? Because I do believe that the pre-clearance makes 1,000% sense. To do away with it is to presume that we have racial progression and that the things that enacted the Voting Rights Act to begin with are not very evident in our society. So I don't think that even in replacing pre-clearance back in it and taking away Shelby is going to necessarily put us on the right trajectory, but rather there are fundamental steps, whether that's voter education, whether that's education on voting in general, whether that's making sure you actually know how to fill out a ballot rather than just translating a ballot into Spanish and then using the same language that isn't representative of that demographic or that identity, and then saying, hey, you should be able to participate in this democracy without having been represented before. So I'm trying to figure out what can we do from a grassroots perspective, from where I stand as a 22-year-old, other than going to the polls or helping somebody else, because it's not only my identity, but several other people who are constantly barred from being able to act in democracy and being told, this is how you actualize your power, this is how you make use of who you are in society via that number on your ID, right? How do we make use of that when all these problems are a domino effect? They're all tangential to each other. So it's like, even when we fix one, there's still yet 10 more barriers to go through. Sorry, I was thinking through all of that. And I know that there's no short answer, but yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
I think that's a great question. Thank you so much. I think a couple of things. One thing you can do that any person can do in this country is spend time volunteering, registering people to vote, and encouraging people to vote through Get Out the Vote campaigns. You can do that through your campaign or political party of choice, or you can do it through one of the dozens or maybe hundreds of nonpartisan voting rights advocacy groups out there who are really just fighting to pass legislation, but also to get individuals one by one, kind of in the very slow process, registered to vote at their new address when they move, reminded to vote in the local elections that no one votes in, et cetera. Another kind of prompt or idea to mull over might be the idea I bring up at the end of my semester. We spend a whole semester talking about voting, electoral institutions, electoral democracy. It's kind of hammering voting over the head. And then at the end, I kind of drop a bomb and run away. And the bomb I drop is this claim: electoral democracy won't save us. And this is kind of an activist rejoinder to this emphasis on voting in elections. And I think we can probably have both, but I always want to get students thinking about the importance of voting as preservative of all of their rights. It's a sacred right, but there are other means of political participation, right? There's protests, social movements, activism, civil disobedience, calling your legislators and elected officials, maybe running for office yourself, campaign contributions, writing petitions, calling your representative. There's other means of political participation that can be important too, and that can feel good to do, right? Sometimes I think what we're leaving out of the conversation is the joy and energizing effect that political participation can give us.
So I'm glad you went there, because when we bring Bruce into the conversation in a couple of minutes, I know that civic participation is one of the things that he wants to talk about. One last question, and again, if you have questions and you are joining us online, you can add those into the Q&A feature. If you're in the room, we have microphones, and you're welcome to ask those questions here. One of the things that we heard from our students earlier was this: when it comes to federal law, there are some areas of agreement. One of the things that we always see, and I spent 18 years covering Congress, is legislation gets bogged down because everybody wants to put every single detail into it. But there are some areas of agreement. For example, this question asks, would it be possible to pass a federal law making voting day, election day, a federal holiday as a standalone move? Do you think something like that could pass and land on the president's desk?
Well, you know more about Congress than I do, Tracy, but what we've seen already is a paring down of the John Lewis Act into this current version. We may need to see a further paring down into a pretty minimal piece of legislation, doing being much less ambitious in protecting voting rights than I'm sure congressional Democrats had originally hoped for. But there does seem to be some consensus in Congress and nationwide that voting election day ought to be a federal holiday.
Let me conclude, and feel free to add any thoughts you may have. Let me conclude by asking you, you talked about, and Akila brought this in, and we heard it earlier, the idea of voter education. If voting is a right, then is voter education a responsibility of our government, of our society? We certainly see it happening, but it happens in piecemeal, right? You may have an organization that's a national organization even, but to your point earlier, people may be prompted to register here, they may not there. If voting is a right, then maybe education should be a responsibility of our society. And so where does the federal government's role lie in that?
I absolutely agree that we ought to increase the quality and amount of voting education in this country, both through public schools and through more informal, civil society means. The federal government can take a role in this by encouraging states through incentives programs and other initiatives. But we do run public education at a state level, thanks to federalism. And so a lot of it is up to states. So we're going to see really disparate efforts at voter education state by state. I think, that's coming back to this question of activism, another really exciting opportunity for engagement, right? This can be something we can all do together and for each other, voting education, civic education. The Constitution was, to a certain extent, an elitist document, right? It was not meant to enfranchise everyone who was living or even a citizen of the United States at the time. And I think throughout history, we've seen a tension between the tendency to promote democracy and make government and politics for everyone, and the historical origins of this country as a set of institutions protecting the elite that wasn't particularly interested in making it for everyone. But that doesn't mean, I think, that we can't reclaim that in the future.
I have to thank you, because when we talked earlier today and even this evening, we had 2, maybe 3 things that we wanted to talk about. And you have been so much more expansive than that. Please give a round of applause to Dr. Lucy Britt. Thank you so much. So at this time, I would like to welcome our next panelist for tonight, Bruce Gordon. And I wish you were sitting here in the chair with me, but I appreciate that you were able to join us tonight. He is a Gettysburg graduate and a former trustee of the college, 1968 graduate. He has spent 35 years working in corporate America, and also served a term as the president of the NAACP. And I welcome you into the conversation. Thank you for joining us. Let's take a little bit of a turn, because based on your experience and your background, one of the things that I know that you have spent a lot of time thinking about is the intersection between voting rights and economic justice. Talk to me about why that's important to you and where you feel that link is.
Thank you, Tracy. Thank you for inviting me. And that's a great question, and I promise to answer it. But I've been sitting here listening to this discussion over the past hour. It's been rich. It has reflected and revealed a lot of the thoughts that I've had over the years, and I just feel compelled to at least weigh in. Is that okay?
Please.
Okay, so I agree with a lot of what I've heard, and I really appreciate the input from the students on campus, from Dr. Britt. I would say, just to sort of create some context here, that voting as a part of democracy, and she defined democracy, is a form of power sharing. And it is, in fact, a right, in my opinion. But as Dr. Britt was saying, just as she left the stage, I think that it is viewed as a privilege by many. Certainly the founding fathers saw it as a privilege. Otherwise, when they declared that all men are created equal, they would not have excluded women. They would not have excluded Blacks who were slaves at the time. They would not have excluded indigenous people. So it has always been sort of an exclusive sort of definition of voting. And is it a right or is it a privilege? I need to tell you a story to maybe bring this to life for me. I arrived at the NAACP in 2006, and it was at the time that the Voting Rights Act was going to be reauthorized, because as has not been mentioned tonight, the Voting Rights Act needed to be reauthorized and was reauthorized 5 times beyond 1965 when it was first ratified. In the process of getting engaged in that, I was invited to meet with Al Gonzalez, who at the time was the Attorney General for the United States. And I credit him for extending the invitation to me. And when we gathered, we had some small talk. And then at some point in time, he said, "So what's on your mind, Bruce?" And I said, "What's on my mind is voting rights. And we've got the reauthorization coming up. But I'm concerned about what's happening in Georgia right now, because there's a voter ID law that's been passed by the state legislature. And I think it's a bad law. I think it is biased and it discriminates." He said, "Why do you think that?" I said, "Well, for one, they've taken what are now 17 acceptable forms of identification and reduced it to 5. And they've limited the locations where those 5 acceptable forms of identification can be acquired. And none of those 5 locations, for instance, are in the city of Atlanta. So we've gone from 17 to 5, and nowhere in the city of Atlanta can you access those acceptable forms of identification. He said, that's not right. And if it was true, I'd be upset. He said, but that's not right. I said, with all due respect, sir, I think it is. And I understand that your Civil Rights Division has encouraged you to exercise pre-clearance, which is a part of the Civil Rights Act, of the Voting Rights Act, and not pre-clear that law. So we made an agreement. He said, here's what we'll do. You go back to your team and you find out whether what you've just asserted is correct. And I'll go back to my team and find out whether what I've asserted is correct. And then let's get back together. I said, deal. So I left. He went back to his team. He even called me before I called him and said, Bruce, you're right. That law, as you described it, is exactly what you said. I said, great. So does that mean that you were not going to let us get through the pre-clearance process? He said, no. I said, and that's because, he said, I consulted with the White House and they've assured me that that is not a decision that they want my department to make. So no, we will not get in the way of that state legislation. Just to take it a step further, when it was, President Bush assured me that he would sign the reauthorization if it got through the House and through the Senate. And it did. It got through the Senate 99-0. One person didn't vote. He signed it immediately. I was at the signing ceremony. But before he signed it, before that final Senate vote took place, I got a visit from some influential people on Capitol Hill, and they assured me that whether the reauthorization passed or not, that they already had in motion a movement to overturn Section 5. So the president signed the reauthorization in July of 2006. In August of 2006, the first case opposing the Voting Rights Act and pre-clearance was filed just 1 month following the signature and the 99-0 vote. And as you know, over time, that's what led to Shelby versus Holder, and that's what eviscerated the Voting Rights Act. So I say all of this to say that one thing is very clear to me. From the day our nation was founded until today, there has been a belief amongst some part of our citizenry that voting is a privilege and is not a right. And for that reason, I believe, probably long after I'm gone, that this debate will continue, because for some, they don't want to share the power, and voting is a power sharing mechanism that I believe democracy demands. Sorry to take so long, but I think that we have to look at what's happening in the country today within the context of what's been happening over 2.5 centuries.
And so you actually, and that historical context was relevant and interesting, and you walked right back into part of the question that I wanted you to talk about in terms of economics, because you began and you ended by saying that voting is power, and the right to vote represents power. We see this when we talk about redistricting and we talk about voting blocks. You know, that is part of the privilege or right, depending on how that is resolved, and part of the threat to some of the power of the vote. That said, what is the connection then between the right to vote and the economic power of any given group?
I believe as important as voting is, and I'd never want to position it as being less important than something else, But at the end of the day, when I sort of did my evaluation of what was challenging Black America, to be very specific, in this country, Black America, my conclusion was that we were disproportionately the victims of economic injustice. And to the extent that we could find a way to narrow the gap between the haves and the have-nots, the rich and the poor, those above the poverty line and those below, that would become a basis for solving many of the other problems that plague the country and plague our community, whether it's healthcare, whether it's home ownership. I believe that at the heart of the matter is frankly what I think is plaguing our country today, and that is the fundamental income inequality that is not purely a race issue, but is disproportionately a race issue. So much of my programming and much of my thinking around how to build a better society for all really focuses on how do you establish economic justice. So since I left the NAACP, I've had an opportunity to work with a group of people, and we call ourselves the Black Economic Alliance. This is a group that was founded in 2018, 2017, really. And our focus is on, to shortcut it, what we call work, wages, and wealth. And our belief is that to the extent that we can recommend and have implemented programs that improve the unemployment disparity that exists in our community, that improves the wage disparity that exists in our community, and narrows the household wealth or household income disparity that exists in our community, that those are the kinds of things that can solve a lot of other social ills that plague our country. So if I could just stay with it, you say, so what would you do? What kind of programs, what kind of initiatives matter? You would find that and I recognize that this should and must be a nonpartisan discussion. But that said, if you were to look at the current administration's Build Back Better program, you will see a lot of the programmatic concepts that the Black Economic Alliance has proposed. We've got proposals around job training, around opportunity zones, around entrepreneurship, affordable housing, economic mobility, wealth reentry. We have very specific ideas about things that will bring, frankly, Black and brown people out of poverty into the mainstream of this economy, and do so in a way that not just enhances the community, but enhances the livelihood and the health and the welfare and the vibrancy and competitiveness of the United States.
So let me ask you a question about that, though, and let me play devil's advocate a bit, because do you think that some of those concepts that you just talked about are truly nonpartisan ideas? And I'm going to throw this in there because this is something that Washington talks about all the time. Do they have a nonpartisan price tag?
Do they have a what price tag?
Do they have a nonpartisan price tag? One of the things that we often hear when we talk about, we heard it with Build Back Better. We hear it when we talk about other initiatives like the ones that you talked about is the cost.
So
but the first question is, do you think that those are nonpartisan ideas?
Yes. Short answer, yes. But allow me to elaborate. If you were to talk to any company today, most of them, many of them would tell you the challenges they are facing in hiring. That when they look at the labor market, look at the available labor pool, they are having a difficult time attracting the numbers of people, particularly into STEM, for instance, that they need to run their businesses. So the available labor market is not satisfactorily supplying employers in terms of their needs for talent. So if we were to implement and fund through the government and through the private sector themselves, because it's not just what the government needs to do, it's investment that companies need to make, and companies are starting to make them, to retool and retrain the workforce, to take people into jobs that they might advertise as requiring a college degree, for instance, but in fact simply require a skill set that does or does not warrant or necessitate a college degree, then I think it's a win-win. And the employer community wins, the labor market wins, the country wins, and I believe that matter whether you're on the right-hand side of the aisle or the left-hand side of the aisle, both sides of the aisle would have to agree that the nation's competitiveness in a global market is a nonpartisan issue. In terms of cost, we could spend the night debating how we allocate our tax dollars, but I think it's fair to say, having sat on a number of corporate boards, that if you look at the most recent tax legislation that decreased business taxes, those decreases were even greater than the business community expected. If you had an honest discussion with the Business Roundtable and asked them, did we need to go from 35 to 28 to 21? They would have been pleased with 28. We went too far and gave money back that could have, in fact, been invested in the kind of programs that the Black Economic Alliance has proposed. So I think that affordability, in some respects, is the smokescreen. I think that where there's a will, there's a way. How we go about allocating our national resources, how we go about incenting businesses to invest in the labor market, to invest in the workforce, I think that collaboratively we could implement these kinds of programs and not create the kind of affordability challenges that some opponents to Build Back Better have suggested.
Let me shift back a little more closely and directly to our topic of voting rights. When specifically with regard to civic engagement, Akila brought that up when she asked a question earlier. Dr. Britt talked about that as a large part of what she discusses with her students in class. And I would love to know your thoughts on the importance of, it's a big part of what we do at the Eisenhower Institute. What is the importance of civic engagement in not both helping people to exercise and helping people to understand voting rights?
I've often said that democracy is not a spectator sport. It's something where you've got to get on the field, you got to get muddy sometimes, but you have to be engaged. You can't sit on the sideline and just watch. So I think that it is incumbent upon every American of any race, creed, social status, what have you, to be engaged in how the nation operates. So civic engagement to me it's a given. Now, some folks might say, well, then what do I do? I'm interested. What do I do? I thought a really great question in terms of, how do we get involved on a grassroots basis? And I thought that Dr. Britt's response in terms of just getting involved and get out the vote. In 2020, no matter what side of the aisle, once again, there was plenty of get out the vote activity. And both sides voted at record levels, which, by the way, meant 60%. That's another discussion, by the way. If we celebrate 60% turnout, then that tells you that there's a problem in and of itself. But nonetheless, I think that it is our duty as individuals to be engaged in the process. And one of the things is to register and participate. The other thing is that I think is really a major issue for this country is the abundance of misinformation, which causes people, even those who are willing to participate in the electoral process, to vote, but with the wrong set of facts. So it's not just registration and participation, it is education. And I think finding ways to proactively and aggressively and with a great commitment to activism, engage in the community in which you live, engage with the peer groups, the folks with whom you relate, and ensure that the kind of information exchange that reflects facts, not misinformation, is something that each and every one of us can do and should.
Well, as a former journalist, and I still do some writing. You're kind of up my alley and speaking my language there when it comes to misinformation. But let me ask you a practical question about voting rights and civic engagement. How do you sell this to people? And how do you, maybe sell is not the right concept, but how do you encourage people to be civically engaged? It seems like a heavy lift in some communities with some, when you're talking about a mom who's working 2 jobs and has 3 kids at home, when you're talking about seniors who may not have transportation, sometimes young people who we see on a large scale are very civically engaged. But it is not, how do you make it a larger priority for people to understand that this is not just something to do, but it's something that's fundamental to helping to preserve that right to vote and other rights that you have as a citizen in this country?
I'm not going to sit here and tell you that it's an easy sale, because in some respects, I don't think it is. But I also think that part of the sale is convincing people that they can make a difference. I think that a significant segment of our population, and I'm afraid to say that I think it's particularly in the younger generation. If you look at voter turnout, the least represented demographic segment was 18 to 24-year-olds. They voted less than any other age group in America. So there's a problem there, right? And if you ask them why, I found myself in a town hall meeting during my tenure with the NAACP in a church in Harlem that was packed, and we were talking about voting. And a young woman raised her hand, and I'm going to guess that she was somewhere between 18 and 24, but she raised her hand and she basically said, "I don't get it. You folks are sitting up there on the stage telling us we need to vote. I don't get it. What makes you think that my vote will really make a difference?" So I think that part of the pitch, part of the sale is making the case that your vote will change your quality of life and the quality of life of your neighbors, your community, your family, your friends, that voting really changes and determines what the people you elect do on your behalf. If you choose not to engage, then effectively what you're saying is that you're willing to sit on the sidelines and you'll take whatever happens to you. So you have a choice. Either you get involved and try to shape the nature of your life, or you stay uninvolved and you live with whatever you get. So I think that and by the way, this young woman, at least she stopped in her tracks. She thought about it. I can't tell you where she went from there, but I think that discussion, that sales pitch, has to be focused on this is in your best interest, 1. 2, you can make a difference, that every single vote counts. You can take the statistics from the 2020 election and recognized that the margins of victory were not counted in the hundreds of thousands. They were counted in 10,000 or 5,000. They were counted in very small numbers. And getting people to understand that their vote really does make a difference and it can change their lives is at least the beginning of that sale. I also think, if I could just say one more thing, Tracy, I think about the people who hopefully are on this call who were students today. I know that a significant percentage of them have student loans. I know that they are already thinking about the debt that they will have when they graduate. And how will they begin to pay that debt back before they can begin to create wealth for their families? Well, depending upon how they vote and where they vote and for whom they vote, they can possibly get some relief from that debt, as we have seen over the past couple of years. So I also think that the sales pitch has to be personalized. It has to be, you have to educate and say, this candidate stands for these issues, and these issues stand for you. And if that's the nature of the conversation, I believe that the sale can be made.
You know, as someone who has spent a lot of time working in my own community locally, I would have to say that that makes a lot of sense. And you've explained, and then you kind of demonstrated by example as well. You know, we say all politics is local, all civic engagement is local as well. People really have to see and feel and understand how their vote has an impact on their wallet, on where their kids go to school, on whether or not their roads get paved, as opposed to some of the larger ideas that are very important but difficult for people to translate sometimes. I think
For sure.
We have
For sure. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Can I just say one thing?
Sure.
I also, because the point you just made is oh so important. And I think that as a nation of prospective voters, we have a tendency to focus on the presidential. That's the big election. And then we hibernate for 4 years and say, I'll see in another 4 years.
And the numbers show it. Right.
And what people don't stop to think and pay attention to and promote is that it's not just federal elections, it's not just the national landscape, it's the state, it's the local. And when you get people to think not just about who's in the White House, but who's in the State House and who's in City Hall and who's serving on the Board of Education, these are more intimate, they're more personal. And the more personal you can make this discussion about civic engagement, the better off I think we will all be.
We have just a couple of minutes left. I just want to remind people in the room, if you have a question, we do have microphones. Those who are online, you are welcome to use the Q&A feature. We did have a question I wanted to from our online audience. Is there any path to make voting less political and ensure that it's a right and not a privilege? Is there a middle? Eisenhower would ask, is there a middle way here?
I don't know is the honest answer. I don't know, because at this stage in our nation's history, we are so polarized that I think that people say, if I'm on the right side and the left wants A, the answer to that is no. I don't even care what A is. And the left looks at the right and says that the right wants B, no, because the right wants B. I think we are so extremely polarized that it's hard to depoliticize it, unless you take off the labels, you take off the brands, you eliminate the rhetoric, because there's a lot of rhetoric out here, and you stay very micro issue based. And I believe the more micro issue based we are, the more, once again, the more relevant it becomes to the individual. And I do believe that people, no matter how discouraged they are by their ability to influence the outcomes in the political arena, when they start to hear and see things that become personal to them, that inspires them to engage. But we do live in a highly polarized environment, and I wish I could offer you the secret sauce, but I don't have it.
Well, I think what you have offered us tonight as we close, we're at the point where we need to close tonight, but I think what you have offered us are some good insight, but also some real applications here to look at voting as a means of civic engagement, to really look at this as a very local issue, as opposed to some of those larger presidential issues that you talked about, national issues, to look at this as local, and look at our right to vote as connecting with where our kids go to school and how we pay our local taxes, and what happens with the local grocery store, shopping center around the corner, and whether we're depending on where you live, whether the potholes get fixed in your roads, or perhaps here in Adams County, as I have noticed driving back and forth to work, whether road construction happens. I think that's a very practical lesson that you've given us that we can walk away with tonight. And I want to thank you for joining us tonight. Thanks a lot, please. Thanks for being our guest.
More than welcome. More than welcome.
I would like to close by sharing with our audience tonight just a couple of thoughts. We spent a lot of time tonight not only talking about voting rights, we talked about economic justice, we talked about democracy, and a number of other things as well. I do want to let the students of Gettysburg College and staff and faculty as well know that the Eisenhower Institute will be offering an experiential learning travel experience this year that we are calling the Civil Rights and Social Justice Experience. This is going to be a great opportunity to see and experience face-to-face some of the history that's behind some of these issues that we've been talking about tonight. We'll be taking a small group of students to Little Rock, Arkansas, to visit not only Central High School, which a lot of people are very familiar with the Little Rock Nine and what happened there, but also to look at communities there and how what happened in Little Rock really had a long and lingering effect on the buildup and then the breakdown, and now the renaissance of some of those communities. We'll also be visiting Memphis, the National Civil Rights Museum, and looking not only at the Eisenhower legacy with regard to Dr. Martin Luther King and some of their exchanges, but also some of the economic justice issues that Bruce talked about tonight. So this is the first announcement, so you get to hear about that. Tonight, we are looking forward to students applying for that experience. If you know someone who you think would be interested in or benefit from this conversation tonight, it will be posted on the Eisenhower Institute's YouTube page, and that will be sometime next week. So we're going to give Kevin a chance to get that edited, but you can find this conversation and other interesting conversations on our website and on our YouTube page. And then finally, we spent a lot of time talking about young people tonight. And coming up in April, one of our next events, we are inviting an author who has spent 20 years polling Generation Z, well, now Gen Z, it was a younger generation when he started, about their political views. And we're bringing him to the campus to talk about not only that 20 years of polling, but now looking forward, how they plan to take action on some of those things. John Della Volpe has written a book called Fight, and we are looking forward to bringing him here to talk about what he has experienced and seen young people doing to really take action on some of those things. So thank you very much. Thanks to our audience in the room. Thanks to our audience online tonight. We look forward to seeing you at our next Eisenhower Institute event.